Welcome to the Derek Loudermilk Show. This is episode 317 with Nik Wood. Today's guest, Nik Wood, is back on the podcast, and interestingly, we recorded this episode to use for both of our shows. Nik hosts the Life Athletic podcast, and we recorded it a few weeks ago. And now he's here in my house. He's visiting me. He's staying for Christmas. So we didn't know that at the time, but it's a cool little completion of the circle. So on this episode, we talk about global goals. And Nik has this great concept he's been working on. Where do we want to go as a species? It's actually really hard to define exactly what you want or what we want. And, a lot of our leaders have gone from sharing a vision to just avoiding a nightmare, just vote for me so we don't have to have something else. And so there's a difference here. And Nik talks about, a personal experience that he took himself through, a trauma releasing experience. But we talk about what it might take for us to heal collective trauma so that we can move forward and actually, choose what we want as humanity. So Nik, he shares some of his personal story. He cracked his skull open, and so he's still in the process. That was a year ago. He's in the process of coming back from that. And this show, because we intended it to be used on both podcasts, is more of a conversation. It's more of a back and forth. We're sort of interviewing each other. So you hear us just sharing a lot of little tidbits to help each other, recommendations, books, thought leaders, movement, trauma, habits, self-esteem, all of these different things. So it's a slightly different style, but I know you're going to enjoy this conversation with Nik Wood. So here we go.
Derek Loudermilk.
Nik Wood.
So since this is going to be a joint episode, I'm going to welcome you to the Life Athletics podcast, and thanks for joining me.
And for listeners of the Derek Loudermilk Show, welcome to the Derek Loudermilk Show. Hey, awesome. New podcast.
New podcast. New name, new podcast, new adventure. Throwback inside joke for anyone who gets it. Okay.
Probably almost everybody.
All right. You mentioned that you wanted to ask me about my exodus. Well, you asked the question.
So for a long time, I've heard you say when we were both living in Bali, and then I ended up starting a family and doing all this other travel, and you were staying in Bali, and you're like, sometimes you'd say, I got to get out of Bali. And, but then you stayed for many years, kind of sucked you in. But now you're in Brooklyn, like you're the total opposite of Brooklyn is the opposite of Bali, right? So, after hearing you say that, what was the actual impetus? Like, how did that actually happen? Because for anybody that's listening, moving across the world, changing your whole life there's a lot of momentum in wherever we are, and to actually do that takes a lot. So I'm assuming there was something that happened that shifted for you that made you move.
Yeah, thanks for noticing. I'm going to take off the blue blocker glasses here because I forgot that we're filming. But just where to jump in the story. Essentially, it was complete. The funny thing about Bali is that people, once they're there, realize that Bali either sucks you in or kicks you out. And a lot of people get kicked out right away. We've seen this happen when we were in Bali. People would arrive, sometimes with plans to stay for a long time, and they would get sick, they would get injured, something would happen. They'd get thrown from a scooter, and they just had to leave. For me, it was the opposite. I showed up for a 5-day retreat and stayed for 5.5 years. And I did so because it felt like Bali spoke to me and said, the things that you think you need to work on aren't what you need to work on. And things that you've been ignoring or haven't even been brought up to a conscious level are what you need to work on. And so I listened. yeah, areas where I thought I needed to train up. People were telling me that I could run retreats at that level, I could give talks, and that I was much higher level than I was giving myself credit for. And then other areas which may have just been feeling too basic almost for me to look at were where I was really struggling. And so I had to go through a bunch of experiences where old traumas and dramas got drawn up and out of me. And then something clicked after this big sort of final boss feeling moment, like a video game, where all of that bubbled up to the surface, and I had to shift or go back into it. And once the shift happened, everything just felt different, and it was time to go.
Shift or go back into it.
Yeah, well, I think it's always possible to go back into drama or trauma. And so for those who don't know who I am, Nik Wood, I'm a coach and podcaster, and in some circles, I'm most known for having broken my skull just over a year ago in some weird freak accident at a breathwork workshop. And what a lot of people who know that part of the story don't know is that right before there, like, well, 2 months before that, almost to the day, I did a big trauma release process that was profoundly shifting. But I kept myself so busy right after it that I didn't take time to notice the shifts and let them integrate. I was just so excited.
What was that process called?
It's called internal family systems therapy. It's one of the few therapies in the back of the book, The Body Keeps the Score, that have a proven track record of actually working. And so that appealed to me. And what they say is that 2 8-hour sessions with a therapist while on MDMA, and people are just over their trauma. I self-administered, now that I'm out of Indonesia, I guess I can say it, with psilocybin. And it was profound. I've never felt so loved, held, seen, and just clear internally than I did after that process.
Self-administered, but did you have someone there supporting you?
No, I was by myself.
No, okay.
Yeah, so it was similar enough to things that I've been trained in that I read as much as I could on it before going in, and it felt like I understood the process. And actually, something that you said years ago was something that gave me confidence to go into it on my own, which is you remarked at one point that I seem to be able to be firmly in an experience, feeling it fully, and narrating it at the same time. And I said something like, yeah, can't everybody? And you said, no, they can't. And so I felt that whatever that is inside of me that's able to look at different parts of myself as they're happening and still be experiencing it as it's happening, felt well enough suited. And really the other part is I didn't know anyone around me who did this process, and I didn't want to wait.
Yeah. I'm remembering when I first noticed that about you, we were like in line getting food at a the yoga barn or something like that, and you were going through something, and you were telling somebody, you were like, here's my experience and here's what I'm learning, and I'm like in the middle of it right now. And I was like, you had this meta sort of looking down at your own character, but then you're also experiencing it. And I was like, and then you're just like casually, like, I don't even know if you knew the person in line. You're like, hey, you want to know like what I'm working on right now? Like, let me tell you.
I'd like to blame Ubud in Bali, especially for that, but I might just have had a habit of oversharing. And but either way, yeah, it is a thing that people do there a lot. But anyway, because I fractured my skull 2 months after doing that process, it took me until I recovered from the skull fracturing enough for me to notice that my inner game wasn't the same as it had been before, that things were different. And so I had to back some people off to get enough space to actually feel that out. And yeah.
Do you think there's any connection between your head trauma on a on like a karma level and this work that you did?
Yeah, I'm not sure. People have asked that before, and possibly. And the thing that I haven't shared much was the last thought that I had before I injured myself, which was because I was at a breathwork workshop that I had attended with the same facilitators, with most of the same people at the same venue, 8 or 9 times scattered through the month prior to my injury, and I'd had no issue whatsoever. And so I went into this day thinking, well, this has been really great. I've been enjoying this breath work, but I haven't had the life-changing breakthrough that I wanted to have yet. And so I'm committed to having that today. I
Wow.
closed my eyes and woke up a week later in the hospital with a fractured skull. So, and one of the first thoughts that I had there was that it felt like the end of Fight Club, where the Ed Norton character shoots himself in the head to get rid of Tyler Durden.
Whoa.
And so I don't know if part of me needed to die. Like I didn't consciously go and headbutt the post that I hit my head on. It was a support beam pillar thing. I don't remember doing that, but
For those watching, show me your scar. You've got this just peeking out there, but it's like all the way across your head. Look at that. Wow.
yeah, I have. I saw a picture the other day of my head opened, and
Ugh. Ugh.
I counted 11 little titanium joiners. So
That gives me the willies. I'm not a
I'm
doctor
sorry.
for a reason.
Damn it, man! I'm a scientist, not a doctor. So yeah, yeah. The first time I saw those pictures, I was on my way to do the first public speaking after my injury. Half my face was still frozen with what's it, Bell's palsy, and I couldn't see straight. There was so much inflammation that my right eye was forced up, and so my eyes weren't pointing in the same direction. So I had to walk with a cane, and I was seeing double. And my phone went off, and I thought it was someone maybe wishing me luck, and it was someone who had been around the hospital and helped out, and she sent me pictures of my head.
Oh gosh.
Yeah. Anyway, so let's move on from that. The idea though that once the trauma felt clear, I felt complete with Bali is really the main takeaway for me. And all of a sudden it felt like I'd gone from being in some kind of plexiglass cage to having the door of the cage open. And so for years, I felt like I could see where I wanted to go, but I couldn't move forward. It was frustrating, really basic things. And the frustration of being, in some ways, extremely high level, and in other ways, not being able to do really basic things was infuriating me about myself. And yeah, this is one of the things that I've learned is just typical around people who have trauma in their systems, is the inability to function on some basic levels because the nervous system keeps going to places where we don't have access to certain types of functionality. And so once it felt like that was out of my system, or at least a significant chunk was out of my system, it felt like I suddenly had access. Didn't mean I had mastery, but it was like I was cleared. And yeah, similar to how I'm doing physically now. I can go work out, but I'm really out of shape. But still, it's exciting to be able to go and move my body again, right? So I can now build.
Yeah, gosh. That's one of my greatest fears is losing, some functionality, and you got to lose it and then you got it back, which would feel like an amazing relief for
It's a
me.
great gift. It was a great gift. One of the gifts was also waking up with gratitude. I mean, I'm someone who's done a lot of complaining in my life, a lot of blaming. And so it's not that it was just expected that I woke up with gratitude. So I'm grateful that I did. And part of it was, part of it was that I was so surrounded by love and support. My brother came from Canada. I wasn't sure where I was when I woke up in the hospital and I saw my brother first off. I thought maybe I was in Canada somehow, but everything had been taken care of. And so I feel like the people around me were more traumatized by that experience than I was. I just had to heal and then build. And so, yeah.
Did you have anything like when people experience death for, before their heart fails and then they come back, where you like get to see the other side or anything like that?
Not that I have any recollection of, no. No, people have asked that and I almost feel disappointed. No.
It's totally different than you expect. It's
Yeah.
just
No, the closest that I've had to anything like that was with ayahuasca or specific journeys in psilocybin mushrooms.
yeah. So I know you've done ayahuasca in South America, and we've done mushrooms together before.
Yep.
So what was different about this time to be effective for you versus before?
Well, the intentionality and the structure. So it's really interesting because I've done mushrooms in a group setting that was more like a party or a gathering, and I've done them where it feels very focused. And do you want to pause? You got a little
And the interloper, you
tiny
guys
invader.
can hear that. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's my daughter.
Aw, so cute. Um, so yeah, the container, right? The context is decisive. And so having the clear intentionality to do what I did shifted a lot inside of me. Yeah, I'm not sure what to say beyond that. Having done mushrooms before, having done them with you and other people, I wasn't doing a much more significant dose than I had done those times, but the container was set slightly differently. And um, so I did series of meditations and journaling and intention setting and writing before I took anything.
And then during the experience, were you like following some steps that you had set for yourself?
Well, so internal family systems therapy is basically a parts integration modality where it's similar to family dynamics counseling or family counseling, but looking at the different parts of ourselves as different characters that might not be getting along very well. And so the idea is to ask the other parts to leave you alone with the part that seems to be the one we don't like, for lack of a better term, right? So imagine you're at a party, everyone is behaving nicely, everything is going to plan, and that feels like a victory. And then some loud, dirty drunk storms through the door screaming, and everyone gets mad all of a sudden. All these nice people are like, everything would be great if you weren't here. And so that's how it was internally, right? If only these parts of me would just shut up and leave me alone, then everything would be okay. And so what this process does is it has you ask those suddenly judgy parts of oneself to leave you alone with the offender. And you say, look, I'm not going to give them any more power. I'm just going to talk to them. And all of a sudden the judgment melts away. And you have a conversation with this part of yourself where you are trying to see the goodness inside of it, right? And then once you see the goodness, you want to look at what is its burden? What does it think it has to do? Because it's essentially like some dirty drunk storms in and it thinks that there's a bomb at the venue where this party was happening. And if it doesn't go and diffuse this thing, then everyone's going to die, right? It's like this intensity. And so what you do is you basically relieve it of its burden, right? Yeah, there's another metaphor that helped. I knew someone who every time she got mad, she would say, my inner teenager's coming out. And after enough times of that, I said, well, can you tell me how you were as a teenager? She said, oh yeah, I shaved my head and I wore steel toe boots and I would go and hitchhike and not tell my parents. And I would show up in other countries and say, okay, got it. And then I said, how were you as a kid? Did you feel infringed upon and in danger as a child? And she was like, yeah, quite often. So, oh, okay. So is it possible that that teenager developed as a protector for the inner child? And that really what's happening was the inner child inside of this person was feeling threatened. She's like, oh yeah. So I started picturing that, right? If a teenager was trying to protect a small child and a bunch of well-meaning adults were trying to take the child from it, the teenager would get angrier and louder. And what it would need was someone to back off the well-meaning but horde and say, hey, thank you for protecting this child. I've got it now. I'm here. I'm an adult. I can take care of this. You don't have to be responsible. You don't have to go even, right? You can make sure I'm doing it right, but I got this. And all of a sudden the relief that that teenager would have of having a responsible, caring adult is how I pictured it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did that internally. I made a list of every part of myself that I wished would just piss off and went through this journey of embracing it and clearing it and relieving those parts of the burden and allowing another part that felt more appropriate to where I'm heading to take over that job. And I felt a massive internal shift.
Wow, that's I like your expression of seeing the plexiglass cage and having the door open, and then I mean there's still the task of, as what we were talking about in the very beginning. There's still some people, the door is open and they don't walk through it because it's still more comfortable just to stay in the box, stay in the cage.
Well, people talk about like it's a phenomenon. Some people, when they leave prison, actually feel more comfortable in prison. It's like at the end of Castaway where the Tom Hanks character can't sleep on the bed because it's so uncomfortable. He wants to sleep on the floor in the hotel room.
That's real. I interviewed these people that spent a year in the wilderness, and when they got home, they would like freak them out. They were like, they would sleep on the floor, or they would just like go sleep in their backyard. They were like, it's just too weird to sleep in a bed. Mm-hmm. Took them like 6 weeks to learn to sleep in a bed.
Yeah. Even the beds from Indonesia where I was and my place in Bali to here, like these beds are so soft, it's driving me nuts. I keep feeling like I'm going to roll off the side of them. But the fun thing was realizing that I didn't actually have access to certain functional patterns inside of the states that I was in because of the trauma. And for years, I was beating myself up, trying to work harder and not getting very far, and realizing that what was missing was a sense of safety, security to move forward. That Joe Dispenza talks about it in the Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself in that book, in the form of brain frequencies. And depending on which brain frequency you're in, you only have access to certain functionalities. And there's something that I'm recently exploring, which is something called Polyvagal Theory. And what they talk about there is more of a nervous system version of that. Where you are in your nervous system dictates how you get to behave. And so what trauma does is it's the stuck state that the fear from the past is still present. It's this feeling of being in some version of fight or flight or freeze constantly. And so what happened was, after I recovered enough physically from my head injury, the emotional stuff felt shifted from that trauma release, and last little bits had to come up. And it was almost like a test where I saw I wasn't thrown the same way that I used to be. Some things happened. Some people did things that used to upset me. And at first I reacted in a big way. And then I realized a lot of that was fear of going back into the same loops. And when that didn't happen, I was able to respond from a much more adult and secure place. And that's when Bali felt complete.
And what I've come to realize is that um, trauma, any degree of trauma may be controlling your physiology, and you have a physiological response to something, and then your rational mind explains it. So you might be in an argument with someone, they react a certain way, and they're like, it's because you did XYZ, and
Right.
that's not actually it. It's this like physiological response, and then the rationalization just comes because they're just trying to make sense of it, but it's probably not that thing.
It's often not, but it can be important to look at what are the things that are triggering. And even that word, well, most people have no idea what triggering means, or just have a skewed sense of it. Being mildly upset or dissatisfied with a thing isn't triggered. Triggered is being thrown back into an old fixed state of terror, essentially. The pain from the past is present again. And so when people are actually triggered, they're no longer fully present. They're no longer here in their entirety. They're back whenever the trauma happened. And that can be really difficult, especially when the trauma is not a conscious thing. Some people don't have actual memory of what traumatized them. In some cases, and this can be really dangerous, is that because it might not be on paper as horrific as some things that we've heard of, or, I mean, I know people who've been through really, really awful things. And the things that traumatized me weren't anywhere near as bad if we're just going to make a list of bad things.
Yeah.
But because at the time I didn't have the ability to process them fully, they got stuck. Right? So when people say, oh, 2020 is traumatizing, it's a traumatizing year, like maybe, but it's sort of how my head injury, a lot of people are like, oh, trauma, that must have been so traumatic. I don't feel like I have trauma around that.
Mm-hmm.
Because I woke up and it felt energetically and emotionally complete. Though no part of me went into, oh, why did that happen to me? It was just, oh, that happened.
Yeah.
Gosh darn, I guess I just need to keep going now. Right.
Sure.
And so it felt like a very healthy, forward moving energy. All right. It wasn't ignoring it, but it was just, okay, that happened. Now what? And so bad things can happen and we might not be traumatized by them. And then seemingly small things can happen that get stuck. And it's
Yeah, and I
important
do think
because a lot of people dismiss their own pain.
yeah, I think it's important here. Like, there's, maybe who calls it like big T, little T. There's like somebody abused you, like, oh, big trauma, like, or there's like you just like fell down and scraped your knee, you
Uh-huh.
know, and nobody picked you up. So there's like all these varying degrees, and I agree. It's this year, obviously, people are totally the whole range, like the interpretation of how good or bad this is just totally across the board, and there's all these different interpretations of trauma for each person or events, whether they're traumatic or not.
Mm-hmm. Like, so I've been sexually abused. I've been mentally, physically, emotionally abused. But the the sexual abuse, I was molested by this guy, this adult man when I was a kid. But I had a moment where I knocked him over, even as a little kid, and then pushed some furniture that sort of trapped him for a while, and I regained a sense of strength. And with my ex-stepfather, who used to like choke me up against the wall, I at one point realized that I got bigger than him and knocked him over. And he fell down on my little brother's Tonka truck or something, and he looked at me with these big scared eyes, and I just said, "We're done now, right?" And there was one time after that he did something physical. He grabbed me and took chunks of my skin out with his fingernails from the back of my neck.
Jeez.
But for the most part, a lot of my upset was not feeling like anyone was there to protect me. And when I tried to talk to people about it, that was blocked. And so it's interesting because, again, the big T, little T, I know people who've had cigarettes put out on them, who've been hit with wrenches and crowbars and like really, really awful things. People have been raped, and nothing that I've been through compares. And yet that's not the point, is that a lot of this isn't logical. and and if we can't function because something's incomplete from the past and it just brings up pain, fear, um, then it needs to be dealt with. And until I named it, I was so afraid of being labeled that I wasn't looking at trauma. I didn't even want to label myself as someone who had trauma. And when I had to make this distinction between labeling and naming, just saying, oh, that's trauma. And when I did that and I started looking at it, books on complex PTSD felt like they were just written about me. It's like, wow, this is exactly what I've been going through. This is a thing. Oh, because it's a thing that people have studied, potentially there's pathways through it. And then I got through it pretty quickly. But I'd spent 40 years just rolling around in this stuff, thinking I was doing work.
Mm. Man, what I'm feeling right now is just like, I just can't believe. And here's the thing, like, first I'm just amazed when you say like people being hit with wrenches and stuff. Like, how is this even possible?
Well, I mean, I can't even imagine, like, as a parent, right? Like, you're such a loving dad. I see you with your kids, right? I mean, I've been there for a big part of the process, to the point that you call me Uncle Nick with your kids. And I was there when you and your wife got pregnant with your first child, and I was there
freaking out.
I was there through a lot of the pregnancy, but like, I look at my dad's eyes tear up, and I can imagine your eyes tearing up. The idea of a parent hurting their child, right? And then the pain of the child feeling that this is the person that's supposed to protect me.
And just the other day, I told my daughter not to put her hand in her glass of milk, and she got so sad. And I was like, oh no, what have I done? I'm like, I'm just doing my job. I'm trying to teach her to be polite. And it's like, oh God, could I traumatize her by telling her no?
Yeah. And some of these things we have to understand are just normal, right? Like, disagreements are normal, right? Having certain forms of discipline are normal inside of that relationship, but that's not the same as abuse. And I think so much of the dialogue that seems to be happening out in the world, people don't understand the difference anymore.
Well, here's something I want to share. Something that I've been noticing in my parenting a lot. And when I do things with my kids that I wouldn't do with adults, like pick them up and put them in the bath, like I wouldn't do that to a friend, right?
Sure.
And there's a lot of, it's this fine line of like, I get to say what you do, this control. And as a child ages, they have more and more of their own sort of, actually, I don't want to do that. And then you have to negotiate. But it's reflecting, like where am I just like blindly trying to control this other human being versus like taking into consideration. And one example that's coming up is if they're watching cartoons and I'm like, it's time to go, and I just turn them off, they will flip their lid. They hate that, right? If you just change their scenario for them. But if you say like, okay, 10 seconds and we're going to turn it off, or 5 minutes and I'll come back, they're totally prepared for it and they can go along and there's no pushback. And it's just, how often in our lives are we trying to control other people? Are we trying to get them to do what we want them to do? And
a lot of people don't stop. Right.
Yeah.
So you mentioned something earlier that was along the lines of, I forget what you said exactly, but it stuck out with me. It was this idea that someone said something, therefore I'm upset, rather than the inner self. Like, I'm upset because I'm upset. Something happened, now I'm upset. That's how I'm reacting. And what most people seem to do is say, that person said something, now I'm upset. I'm going to now train them not to upset me anymore. Right? Or I'm going to give them my love languages so they can love me properly and quit the bullshit that they've been doing, and and shift it, instead of saying, how can I listen to the way that they love and hear it as love, and train inwardly. Where the parental thing is interesting. I'm not a parent, but my siblings are so much younger than me that I sort of play acted as a parent for a while. So there's a 13 and 15 years age difference between my brother and sister and me. So I'm much older. And I always saw it as my job to make them the strongest, shiniest versions of themselves as I could. And so sometimes that meant having them not stick their hands in their milk or not watching TV all day. And yet it was with the design not to impose my will on them so they bent and kneeled before Zod, just to get really comic book nerdy about it. But to, yeah, I can explain. People can just Google who Zod is.
Google it, look it up.
And yeah, my task was actually to help them be the strongest versions of themselves that they could be. And sometimes I was right and sometimes I wasn't. And I tried to talk them through that as much as possible, right, when it was appropriate. But yeah, there are elements there that I want to ask you about that sort of lead from where I'm at in my process. And I mean, you asked me about leaving Bali, but the thing was, it was a little bit like that cage opened, and then those release videos of animals being released back into the wild, where at first the cage might be open, but they're not sure if this is another trap. And they take a couple steps and smell the air and then head out. There's been this sense of, well, now what? It doesn't mean that all of a sudden I'm operating at the level that I know I could operate on or that I aspire to operate on. And this is one of the things that I've always seen as one of your strengths, is your ability to unhook from the past and reinvent yourself. Because you've had all these different experiences in your life where you've been a scientist or an athlete or a public speaker and podcaster or coach. And sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't. But my fear of labeling myself anything has kept me away from, like, when I played ultimate frisbee in Korea, I had friends who I would say, oh, they're ultimate frisbee players. I'm just someone who plays ultimate frisbee. Like, I was trying to make this distinction, which kept me from training as hard or paying as much attention and doing it fully. Now that I feel more and more prepared to do things fully, I'm realizing there are certain skills I need to learn, even around learning how to do that. So I'd love if you could speak a little bit about, how does one learn to take something on to a high level and start from a low level?
There's a few ways I could go with that, but I want to start with this story of, actually, one time in Bali, I was just driving on the motorcycle and realized, I was like, I have no identity at this point. I had just lost a lot of former identity things, like I lost my marriage, lost my house, lost my career, a lot, and so all those formerly things that I would have said, like I'm a this or that, weren't there. And I was like, I'm just me. Like, I don't have a label or an identity or anything. And it was very perplexing for a while to realize that. And then I was like, okay, well, I just don't have this identity. And then, now that I'm back home and I have some physical stuff, this is really very interesting to me. Physical objects that remind you of high school or elementary school or a trip you took as a kid, or, like my patch from space camp or something. You're like, that's who I was then. And I know what it was like to be that person then. So I'm reluctant to throw this object away to, like, clean my basement or, like, get rid of stuff. So I'm holding this, like, I have all these, I call them Horcruxes, like part of my soul is, like, tied up in some, like, weird physical object.
That's the part of the series that I'm listening to right now, actually.
Oh, really?
I'm really listening to the Harry Potter. I've never listened to it before. But yeah.
So it's just weird, but where I'm working from is, if I have no past, if I have no identity, well, first of all, we only have the present moment. But if I, can totally be free of any past identity, then I'm just who I am. And it makes it weird when you're like trying to market yourself or write a description on LinkedIn or something like, who am I? Because really you're just like making up a thing so people can be like, oh, I want to like hire this person or listen to their podcast or whatever. But yeah, I mean, identity is such a weird thing. Yeah, at this point I'm trying to not get tied up in any of the past identity things that I would have. And so an example of that is I just happened to win the state cycling championships, and I hadn't won since I was a junior. Like 20 years ago, I won a state championship, and now I won the Master State Championship. But the difference is that how much it meant to me about my identity. Like back then, it meant everything. It meant I was like worthy of love and popular and like strong. And what it meant this time was that I was able to deploy my very limited time and training resources while parenting and running a business and doing all these other things, so that I could still win a state championship, but with like the very minimal effort. And I thought that was kind of cool. It was kind of an experiment, and I was like, oh, cool. I can take some of these lessons and apply them to people I'm training. So it didn't necessarily like make me feel like a state champion, although I'm pleased to do well in something that I set an intention for. But just noticing how these two, the same thing, 20 years apart, would make such a big difference to my identity or ego versus not at all.
So, I mean, that leads into part of the follow-up, the idea of being able to win the state championship with limited resources and as elegantly as possible, right? So limited time resources because you're a busy man. And so, yeah, what are the necessary elements to training up? Because the whole life athletics concept that all of life is trainable falls into this. So whether people are struggling inside of relationship or financially or whatever, I feel like it becomes the same thing. How do you train yourself from where you are to where you want to be?
How do I answer that? So for a professional cyclist, the answer to winning races is you just, you devote your whole life to it, and you train all day long, and then you optimize your recovery, and you don't walk at all in between bike rides. You just lie on the couch, and you don't have sex and all of these things. That's not normal for the average population. And so it was a fun experiment. My goal is no longer to try to become professional or to try to make a name for myself. But that being said, so my intent was, I'm going to win this race. I'm going to be the state champion. And then what I think a lot of people do, and I've experienced when I've 100% internally committed and I know that the result is inevitable, all my actions are in line with it. But whenever there's doubt, even if you're like, I want to win, but if you kind of doubt it, then you might half-ass it somewhere along the way.
So do you have a process that helps you overcome doubt? Because I've teased you in the past about just being hugged enough as a child or something where you don't seem to go into the same spaces that I have gone into in the past of self-doubt and just freeze. And yet I think that it would be doing you a disservice just to say that it's just natural and easy all the time. So how do you get through those experiences?
I think I've trained myself to equate discomfort, which I think a lot of people will from there, they'll, if they're out of their element, or if they're trying something new, or if they're stretching to try to do something better than they have in the past, it's uncomfortable for everybody. But so then people will go into doubt from there. They associate it with something, that a train of thought that leads them to doubting themselves and thinking they're not good enough. What I've done is I've associated it with, this is the right feeling. This is the exact feeling that I know that I've had multiple times in the past that have led me towards growth, that have led me towards results. So whenever I get that cold sweat, that butterflies in the stomach, that's a good thing. And so that type of discomfort I've learned to, have as a reward versus a pain to move away from.
So I've encountered this before with people who are high performers. And what's fascinating, so I have this one example where I met this guy who ended up becoming a good friend of mine. And we worked out in the park a few times together. He saw me working out with my little brother. My brother was a teenager, and I was throwing a homemade medicine ball at him over some structure, and this guy trotted it over and was like, "You guys are working out weird. We can be friends." And we became friends. And pretty quickly, he invited me to go play basketball with him. And it was this like Government of Canada facility where I had to pass through security to get in. I wasn't allowed to ask anyone what they did for a living. And it was people from all over the world, some of whom had played basketball at professional levels, some of whom had played high level, like college ball in the States or whatever. I'm tall and a decent shot, and I was able to sort of keep up ish. And the guy who brought me was terrible. And he didn't do the typical, "Well, I'm not very good at basketball," but you can like preemptive apologizing that I see a lot of people do when they're going to be bad at something. He didn't ever comment on how bad he was. And over the weeks and months that followed, I've never seen an adult get better at anything that quickly. And it was shocking. He quickly became one of the better players in that game, whereas everyone else pretty much just stayed the same level they were at. I think maybe I got in slightly better shape after playing regularly, but my skill level is pretty much the same that I went in with. And so I asked him about it, and he said, "Oh, I'd never played basketball before, so I didn't have to be good at it. I know I'm awesome, so I didn't feel like I was bad because I was bad at that." Whereas I think a lot of people, when they try something new and they're bad at a thing, they think that they themselves are bad. And what I hear in him in that story and in you is you have your identity, your sense of self, let's say, separate from your ability to perform in something, especially if it's new and you've never done it before. Would that be accurate?
And if somebody has the identity, like I believe I do, of I'm the type of person that gets good at things really fast, then you're just willing to go through that process of discomfort and immersion. And so you know, like the type of person who gets really good really fast is willing to do whatever it takes, including messing up a bunch.
I love that. So, okay, I'm someone who gets good at things quickly or very fast. Is a really powerful belief system to build from, right? And I love habits of thought and habits of action. This is a powerful habit of thought and a huge reframe. Another one is around like the permission to be bad at something, right? So are you allowed to be bad at something just because you know that you get good quickly, or what's involved there?
I mean, I don't like it as much as anybody else doesn't like being bad at something, you know. Yeah. When you're trying to do something and your skill just isn't there, like I see it in my kids sometimes when they're trying to draw and their hands can't move that way, and it's frustrating. Like when I learn, let's say the most recent thing, like a new system of communicating, some sort of thing I'm working on, and then you're just trying to do it, and you're like, I'm just not doing it. I feel so cumbersome. It doesn't feel great in the moment. So I think where I go from there is like an immediate process is like, wow, but I'm practicing this. I'm training it, like, and I give myself a little pat on the back for the attempt. And then, there's probably some parts of it that I got right and some parts that I didn't.
Where I've struggled is, I talked about someone recently, the episode's not out yet, but about this idea that so many people talk about proving the doubters wrong. I feel like I've had the opposite thing to deal with. Whether it's because of my size, because I sound a certain way, because I show up a certain way. I think I look more secure than I've felt a lot of my life. But when I've shown up at, let's say, I mean, now I'll be 42 soon, but when I was younger, especially, it still happens a little bit. I would show up somewhere. I'm 6'6", 200 something pounds, and if I'm at a volleyball court, there were always rumblings of like, "Oh no, look at that guy! Wow!" And then I'd play, and everyone would be spiking the ball at my head as hard as they could, and I wasn't very good, and they'd be like, "Oh." And so I felt like it was everyone expecting me to be great, and then disappointment. And if I was okay, that was still disappointing. And if I was great, that was just expected. And so what I've noticed in myself, and I've had to call myself out on that. So Ido Portal talks about 3 types of training areas: level 1, level 2, level 3. And level 1 is, I've never done this before, I'm no good at it. Level 2 is competency, and level 3 is mastery. He says you should train yourself up in all 3 areas, and the biggest area of growth is level 1. And I step into most things mid-level, midway through level 2. And I've sort of pumped my ego up, being like, oh, I'm pretty good at just about anything I try. But the reality is I've avoided things that I'm bad at, like the plague, and blamed other people's expectations of me and the disappointment that they seem to have. I mean, even something that you said to me years ago still echoes in my head, and I love it, and it still echoes in my head. You're like, how are you not more famous? And it was like this beautiful compliment, but at the same time, it was like, this was echoing over the last year. It was like, trauma is why I'm not more famous. And as I get to the other side of the trauma, I'm like, okay, well now lack of skill or practice and notoriety is why I'm not more famous. So now I can build, I guess.
And as you say that, and I've talked to other people who like definitely were famous and they didn't really want to be, or they just got thrust into it. Now I'm like I was assuming like everybody wants to be famous. Like,
Sure.
why wouldn't you want to be famous? You could mobilize people to change the world. And then, some people, there's like, I don't really want to be famous. I just kind of like living my life.
And then, one of those questions on I forget who did it, but there was the scientist who brought couples together, and they weren't actual romantic couples. They were people who fit each other's attractive specs. I'm not saying this right. Well enough.
Physical attraction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And the scientists would have these people ask a series of, I think, 30 questions back and forth. And afterwards, if they maintain eye contact and ask these questions, there'd be a feeling of love present. And one of the questions is, do you want to be famous? And if so, how? What kind of fame do you want? And I do want to be famous, but the kind of fame that would allow me to still walk down the street and not be chased like I was one of the Beatles. Right? I want to be able to have a seat at some significant tables. I want to be able to start being involved in conversations that will shift where we go as a species. So I don't feel like that conversation's happening loud enough. And that's what interests me and where I feel like a lot of my work is going. And so I appreciate that question, and I appreciate the inherent compliment behind it. But my inability to sit with where I'm at and where I need to train myself up has been a big factor in me not building the following that I think I'm capable of building.
This is reminding me of my, sort of multi-year study of adventurers, and they're probably the most confident people I've experienced. And one of that is because you get to a point where you've experienced so many different being a beginner in so many different ways, like new language, new environment, new survival needs, new time zone, new sport, it's just, new physical thing you have to learn to do, new, so they've realized that they have what it takes in all these different realms. And then all of a sudden you are left with this confidence, like no matter what comes, whether it's I have to navigate relationships in a certain way, or have physical strength or mental stamina or focus or the ability to learn something quickly. They've done it before in some capacity. And so that's where that real deep confidence comes from, is this variety of being a beginner in so many different ways.
I was just looking up the name of this one author. Nathaniel Branden wrote a book called The Six Pillars of Self-Esteem. And he talked about self-esteem being the innate sense that you can or are enough to handle whatever comes up. And one of the things that I see in adventurers is the sense that, well, I can figure that out. I can figure whatever out. If it's figure outable, I can figure it out.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a very important part of being able to step into the unknown.
And you were talking about, I can't remember how you put it exactly, but it's like seeing it as something bad or something good. Like if you know you can figure something out, if you know something is figure outable, it's not a problem.
Right.
So it doesn't have to be solved. It's just like you're in a process of like going through the thing. And there's a big difference between having a problem or not having a problem and just having a situation.
I see even with puzzles, some people won't even open a Sudoku book because they think it's too hard, as opposed to, like, I like Sudoku. I don't know how to pronounce it properly, but Sudoku? I don't know. Yeah, but I think you know what I'm talking about.
Say it enough times and a portal opens and you...
Beetlejuice. Yeah. So, like, I get excited when I see one of those puzzles, and yeah, it's not something that makes me freeze, but I watch some people freeze. Whereas I'm so used to typing and being told that whether my spelling is right or wrong, that having to write by hand in front of people, I watch myself sometimes freeze up. Right. And I can write, I can spell. And yet there's some part of me that gets nervous inside of those moments. This is the first thing I could think of where I get nervous over a silly
I've had that experience
thing.
where you're like in front of a group of people, like writing on a whiteboard, teaching something, and you're like, I'm misspelling this. I know I am. And then you just, this has happened to me. I just only write the first half of the word because I'm so worried about misspelling it that I just stop writing altogether. And then I look around and I'm like embarrassed, and then I'm like, oh, this is making me more relatable. Like, okay, just misspell it. Like, okay, this is good.
I thought you just finished it like halfway through and just expected people to catch on. It was ... Yeah. So with life athletics, we tend to look at different areas of life, right? So work, play, and work is more dharma, purpose, than it is your job. Play is more about what rejuvenates your soul and spirit, and yeah, recharges your battery. Mind or learning, and body, relationships, finances, inner game, and then outer game. And what I find fascinating is how often people will think that some of the areas are just handled and then start ignoring them. And so, or like they have to have permission to move forward. Right? Play is one that comes to mind. There's a couple people that I was interacting with recently and taking through my program where they look like there's so much fun on the outside that they weren't actually managing time to have fun. And so they're burning themselves out and not playing at all, and felt like they had to earn the right to do things that were fun. And
I've definitely experienced, a lot of entrepreneur culture is this hustle and grind,
right,
sort of productivity oriented culture. And I've even noticed myself, I go in cycles where I'm like, I just have to be working, until I go to bed, from when I wake up to when I go to bed, or else I'm going to be behind or something. And then my kids will come in, like earlier in this interview, they'll come in like, hey, look, like, I got a thing. And it's, um, there's this huge gift, right, of people being forced to stay at home. There are probably some dads and moms that were going to miss their kids' early years, get to actually be there for it, and they lose productivity from it. And it's like showing us, like, you get this you get this opportunity to do something that's actually way more important, and you're probably still feeling like you should be working more. And I'm imagining that some people are actually getting better outcomes from working less, playing with their kids more, or chilling out more.
What's something I find with the people that I coach is most people who come to me for business coaching, what they need is to actually play more. Most of them are hard workers and innovative, hyper intelligent, and they're just getting burned out and starting to resent their businesses. And so when they give themselves the opportunity to play, I mean, one guy full on, we had to prescribe him a week of doing nothing but going to the beach and surfing. And he did that. And he came back and said that he was at a cafe talking to someone on the phone, just a friend. And someone came over and said, hey, I heard you talking and want to know more about what you do. And so he signed a $200,000 deal just because he was vibrating and just exuding joy all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's so many stories there. And yet, even I know that about myself, and sometimes miss holding those spaces. So something that I noticed that you do, that I do to a certain extent as well, is you find wonder through the world. I have this little macro lens that I can screw to my phone, and I'll go and look at the minutia of the world and take pictures that I think are really beautiful, that I can't even see with my regular eye, as a way to train myself to know that there's something miraculous to be seen pretty much everywhere. You do it slightly differently, but I'd love for you to talk about, what do you do to make sure that life stays interesting and adventurous?
Well, what's coming up for me is, I was actually going back to this winning the state criterium road race, and there were times when I was like, actually, I don't want to train this way. I actually don't want to go out and train. And I was like, is there a way that it would be fun? Like, could I do something different? And so what I was doing a lot this year was having little races against myself. There's this app, Strava, that people use for running and cycling and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
where you can go and sort of race other people that have done the same segment before. And so I was doing a lot of these little races against people from 10 years ago, where they set a time on a segment and I would go try to beat it. So that was really fun. But I would see my teammates are like going out for a set of intervals, and they would just go up and down the same stretch of road. And I was like, I've done that. I did it for years. It's not super exciting for me. I don't need to sort of train the same way. So before each ride, I would ask myself, can I make this an enjoyable training experience? Can I explore? So I did a lot of neighborhoods. I went to a new neighborhood to try to learn about my city. So a lot more exploring and just being in a new place. So I was prioritizing fitness less than sort of freshness.
Mm.
So that was just one way. And so I never really got bored of training or had to take time off because I was overtrained or anything like that. I was ridiculously undertrained. But so one of the things I have two kids, and so I was often pulling them in the trailer. I pulled them in the trailer for a total of, let's say, I think I calculated out about 800 miles out of my 5,000 were with kids. So about 20% of the time I'm pulling an extra 85 pounds in the trailer. And most of my workouts were done pulling them up a hill, as hard as I could with an extra 85 pounds. And that's pretty much my only workout opportunity. So I did 500 max effort sprints with the kids in the trailer. So every little steep rise, just full on sprint. So I've trained this system, this like 30-second to 1 minute long sprint is highly trained, and everything else is, pretty much very mediocre. But that's all I needed is a high level 30-second sprint to at the very end of a race to be able to, to win by an inch or whatever.
There's a couple things there that I really want to underline.
Go ahead.
The idea of freshness, right? Because that can be brought into, even if you're going back and forth down the road, there's ways to bring that freshness into your experience. And it reminds me of something that my friend Preston Smiles said recently. And Preston's been really great since my injury, sending me messages and very, very, very kind. But yeah, he wrote, or he did a video not too long ago where he talks about how the point of prayer and the point of chanting isn't just to get the sounds out. It's to get the embodied sense of and the aligned connection to the divine. And so often I think people train, and they train themselves into an upset state where they're in their head saying, this is hard, this is hard, this is hard, this hurts, can't wait till this is done, right? And the reward is sitting on the couch, right? And what I find makes such a difference when I catch myself is to bring in a sense of joy or accomplishment, even if it's hurting. I found this schoolyard near here that has a bunch of training equipment that I'm able to use, big tires that I can flip. And I hadn't flipped tires in a while. And like I said, I'm still kind of recovering from my head injury. At the very least, I just not in super shape. And so that was hard for me. And so I'd done a bunch of kettlebell swings, and then I was flipping this tire on this football field, and was really focusing more than anything. I'm still trying to make sure my form was good, but on this is making me who I want to be. I'm being who I want to be because I'm flipping this tire. And that was giving me a sense of accomplishment and joy. And I just find that it makes such a difference to be in, to manage state. And so what I hear when you talk about focusing on freshness instead of just fitness, because you're getting the fitness in as well. You can say, oh, I was severely undertrained, but you won the state championship and you did a lot more than most humans will ever do in a decently short period of time, right? So relative to whatever, you might be undertrained, but you were training, but you were focusing on state is how I see it, making sure that you were still enjoying the experience, having fun. And as I was talking before, we can only access certain types of thinking and certain functionality depending on what brain frequency we're in and depending on what nervous system state we're in. Therefore, if you're managing your thoughts and your emotions at a certain place, you're making sure you're staying in a certain brain frequency in a certain nervous system state. And so I think that's high level stuff and really important to underline.
I think, yes, choosing your state, but I think probably I actually chose this a long time ago in some regards. And then a lot of what I'm doing is sort of habitual in terms of, at least on the fitness side of things.
Sure.
Where it's actually kind of weird. If I were to revert to habit, I would just train at 4:30 every day. I would just go out and train for 2 hours. But the sort of new way of doing it is checking in. Is this actually in my highest interest to go train in this way today? So it's interesting to notice the habit is like the identity of an athlete and the habit of training every day for 20 years is there. But I get to decide now if that's really how I want to be spending my time. And the other day, I
also love that question of, is it in my highest interest rather than, is it like, if it's in my flow, which to me reads as mood. Whereas highest interest, you might not be in the mood to do it, but if it's in your highest interest, you might still do it anyway.
Well, yeah, and sometimes I wouldn't want to do it, and I would say, but if you know, but there's the a state champion or any champion isn't isn't going to. It doesn't matter, right? So if you know something needs to get done, if you know you need to get certain workouts in, the minimum to keep you going and progressing, then they would just do it, right? So it can go both ways. You're like you could choose not to, or you can say the identity of somebody who is a champion does this whether they're actually already a little tired or had a bad day or whatever it is.
The whole filming thing is new for me, so I'm checking out the list of different topics
Oh yeah,
that we
well,
sent
I
back
think
and forth.
this might be a good time because you mentioned wanting to move towards the conversation of where we want to go as a species.
Yeah.
So this might be a good final topic for us to cover today, because as I look at we've got an election coming up here in the US. As I look at, okay, we've got these two choices, these two old dudes that were basically offered, like, here, you can pick between. And I notice how that's a bind. If I want to bind my kids, I would say, do you want to clean your room before or after bath? And I'll just get, like, here are your two choices, not giving them the choice to not clean their room. So we've got this system that says, like, here's these two choices, like, this is what you get. And the two choices are the symptom of the system. And, I don't really like either of them. I don't really want to pick, but that's sort of what's forced. And so I was like, if I had it my way, it would be different. I would pick somebody who I really do like, for starters. And that question, I posed this a couple times on my social media, like, if you made the rules or if you got to say how the world was, what would it look like? And it didn't really get many people engaging because, one, it's a huge thing. It's like, it's too complex. Like, I don't exactly know where to start, or
Hmm.
I don't really believe that it would be possible for me to make a difference or whatever. And there's a lot of also this, here's what I don't want, but maybe I don't necessarily know what I do want.
Yeah, that's the common one.
Yeah. So let's just go on that topic of, what we want to create as a
Well, I want to
species.
dive in for 1 sec just to the what's so of the situation. Whereas as a species, we're operating the same way that an individual does who's carrying trauma and doesn't have clear goals. So when working with who's carrying trauma and doesn't have clear goals, that's difficult. Doing that on a species level is also difficult as a possible understatement, right? And so where it's challenging is most people aren't in the place where they can exist inside of vision functionality. Just to go into that brain frequency and nervous system state. Most people are inside of fight or flight survival mode, right? And so from that place, they only have access to certain types of thinking. And more um, leaders have gone from this idea, and I forget where I heard this, but leaders have gone from sharing a dream to presenting the avoidance of a nightmare. If you don't vote for me, then you will have this nightmare happen.
Mm. Mm.
Right. And so in order to move forward, we need to essentially create a way to clear collective trauma, which mostly is just being ignored, and then to start being able to build up. Right. So the people who aren't in a trauma state, right, but we need to stop saying things like first world problems and start saying there is privilege, and people who are in a privileged state have a responsibility. And when you're not worried about where your next meal is going to come from, you get to start thinking, what do I want? But what most people don't do is say, what do I want for the world? What do we want for the world? And instead focus on self. But yeah, so my aspiration is to get everyone up to the place where first world problems are all we've got. And we can start to build up from there. Because if people have enough food, shelter, clothing, basics to function, then we can start having a collective conversation forward. If we can start clearing collective trauma, which I do believe is a thing, then we can start moving forward. So that even just is to get us to a base level of functionality. Then I have some ideas of visions of where I'd want to build towards. But
the first thing I'm thinking like, well, gosh, I'm surrounded by people with first world problem. I'm here in the first world now. But if people are using any type of media, they're probably exposed to some sort of, this avoiding the nightmare storyline, whether it's the news or somewhere on social media, and it's putting people into a sort of respond, fear,
fight or flight response
state. And so what I think, as we're talking, we just need the whole world to go into a nice Vipassana, just like, let's just have everybody go on a 1 week, no media diet. And that, and then maybe we could all just calm down for a second, enough to like think freely.
Well, I just got chills. And I've been saying for a while that how we language certain topics dictates the viability of said topic. So world peace has been put up as some Pollyanna-ish fantasy that could never happen. But if we all just chilled out and watched and binge watched our favorite TV show for a week, right? There'd be world peace. We wouldn't be actively hurting each other. And that's a pretty good place to start. Like it's this thing, if we just all collectively, like that story of sometime in, was it World War I or World War II, where the German soldiers and Allied soldiers. Yeah. Right. If we just agree to quit it for a certain amount of time, but it becomes that prisoner's dilemma, who's going to blink first. If I can't let my guard down because they're not going to let their guard. But essentially we need to get ourselves out of fight or flight, right? Even the whole right, because I'm in the States now, I'm Canadian, but I'm in the States. The fact that there's a divisiveness of, are you either this or that? Not are you American first, but are you left wing or right wing? And which just seems to be getting further apart. Being centrist almost sounds like a negative space. So any kind of Venn diagram overlap gets dismissed immediately. And the whole Make America Great Again has this implicit judgment that it's bad now and needs to be taken back to some time. And for a lot of people, the past wasn't that great. And so it's a threat to go back to the past, right? Not that long ago, Black people couldn't vote. Not that long ago, women couldn't vote, and worse things. There's just threat. And so what do I want the world to be? I want the world to be in a state where we are okay enough to build. Step one. That's a big step.
Yeah, and I often think like, just some of these, like if I could just take away the barriers, like if it were up to me, if I could choose, everyone would have this psychological safety that comes from being totally confident they're going to have enough food and abundance to get what they need when they need. And when, often when I'm working with clients, one thing that keeps them from being creative or keeps them from doing what's really going to make a difference is maybe they like need to earn money now. And so they make choices that are not sort of in their overall best interest of their business. But there's like, just this contracted feeling of like, I have to just like grab what I can. And it's about me right now. And then, but you can get people out of that when you aim their attention at not just what's in my best interest, but how can I serve people? How can I be creative? And even if somebody's totally out of money, if you can just get them, like there's such a more open place to create from, whether it's a single person's business or the entire global situation. But you have to create some space there.
Oh,
Get some of
totally.
these things handled.
Yeah, there needs to be breathing room. When you ask me a question as a prompt, what are some things that people in my industry get wrong? Right. And one of the things that I feel is off in the coaching industry, which is one of the things that I do, is that people don't look at what healthy would look like. Most people are looking at healing as a sense of fixing a problem. And most of the attention goes to the pain points, to what's wrong. And so a basis of looking at what's wrong and whose fault is it, according to Brian Tracy, is the formula for being unhappy and unsuccessful. And that's how most people are structuring their thinking. And what I think is missing individually and globally, so sort of micro as individual and macro, our species, is what do we want? What would healthy look like? And even healthy is just a baseline okayness. That's not even thriving, right? Someone can be healthy and not win the state championship at anything, right? And so what does it mean to be actually thriving from a healthy state up is, to my mind, not talked about enough.
So if I were to ask you that question right now, what's the first thing that comes to mind that you would want to see for healthy human Earth planetary species?
Right. Well, so the first thing would be we're all in this together as a species, right? So it's that idea of Ubuntu. And my understanding of it is I am because we are. So like I'm okay because we're okay. And I thought of this at a young age. My mother's from Nicaragua. And so when I travel through Nicaragua or through Central America in general, and this happens in the whole world. And my grandfather was a multimillionaire before the revolution. And so I was in these mansions in Nicaragua, surrounded by walls with barbed wire, razor wire on the tops of these walls, and shards of broken glass embedded, keeping everyone out. And that didn't feel like health to me. That didn't feel safe. And I immediately thought, well, the best way to be safe would be if everyone had enough so that they didn't have to come and try to rob us. And so inside of the innocence of my youth, that quickly came up. So a healthy world is where everyone has enough to be okay, to function. It would be a start, right? So that's just healthy. From there, like my vision is of a world where everyone's firmly on their path and actively leveling up to their full yes life. And that might sound kind of vague, but the idea is if people had enough to start building themselves to the highest of their capacity, to unlock the God spark inside of them, it's the best term that I can find, even though I'm not religious, then I don't know what the world would look like at that point, but we would actually start unlocking our potential as a species. And so that's my desire. That's what being healthy would look like.
I was talking, this refrigerator repairman came to our fridge turned off one day, and he was saying he was working so much because of all of his friends, his coworkers were choosing to take unemployment rather than come back to work, even though they could, because it was like just a slight pay doc, but not having to work, because they were on the unemployment pay. And so, This would be a real interesting social experiment. Like if we gave all these people the chance that they didn't have to work for money. I mean, the first thing that probably people would do was spend some time with their family. They would like the stuff that they've been putting off, spending quality time with important people. That's probably what everyone would do for, a few weeks or months. And
Hmm.
then they'd get to a place of like, huh, what do I feel like doing today? You know, maybe I'll go tinker with something, or maybe I'll go create something, or but I don't think we've taken it long enough to see exactly what would happen. But I have this theory that if we had universal basic income for a year, by the end of that year, so many new endeavors, businesses, ideas, movements would be started that people actually really loved, that we'd actually grow the economy by. I think it would be spectacular. I think it would be a runaway economic success. But
There's a piece there. So you go ahead. You finish.
no, that's the gist of it.
Cool. So there's a piece there that I feel is missing, and it's the shift of psychology from I have a job to make money versus I have a job to make a contribution, to make a difference. And so it's amplified in this country, and people are so in it that it's just been normalized. But it's wild being a Canadian who hasn't lived in North America for a decade, because I was in South Korea for 4.5 years, then Bali for 5.5 years. So to be firmly in it all of a sudden, and to hear all this talk about jobs, 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 and no one seems to care about the kind of jobs, the quality of jobs. What are we building? Right? There's a lot that needs to be done. So the fact that there's a job shortage is just baffling to me, because there's so much that needs to be done in the world to build it up to any kind of standard that we'd be actually proud of. And so when jobs are just to make money and people are getting money handled, then they shut down, right? So this fear of it just turning into a welfare state if everyone was given a basic income, I think comes from that foundational sense of we're not operating as a we. Because when we operate as a we, there's a sense of what am I doing to make society better? What am I contributing? And there's still an I in there, right? There's still the opportunity to be an individual and to have my voice heard and matter. But my sense of self isn't based on how much stuff do I have. I mean, I left Bali with a couple suitcases. People were reacting like that was shocking. I mean, I had this 2-bedroom villa in Bali, and I got rid of all the stuff in it, and I kept some essentials. And a lot of people flipped out when they saw pictures of me traveling with 2 large suitcases and a backpack. Like that's it. But like my sense of myself isn't how much stuff do I have. And so yeah, I think that a universal basic income would be magnificent, and would have to be coupled with the sense of discovery of self, and a communal sense. And inside of a country where anything communal quickly gets turned into communist or socialist and therefore bad, there's a leap that needs to happen, because yeah, a lot of communism has been turned into absolute rubbish. But the idea of having a society, right? And we're here as a collective unit. At, I mean, maybe I'm not that nationalistic. I mean, I love being from Canada, but I haven't been there in 5.5 years. I came here first, and from Bali. Like we're in this together, and if we're not, what's the point? So having universal income, basic income, I think would be fantastic, and then a sense of what can I contribute to the world, not just what can I get. So kind of in line with JFK, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Like what can we contribute to the whole?
And I think for the people listening, and this is an experiment I'm doing for myself, is multiple times a day, asking that question of like, am I being of service to other people or to myself right now? And noticing like there's probably still a lot of times where I'm just like grabbing what I can get, being selfish and all this stuff. And so I'm not saying like I'm any better than anybody else
I
in
think
this
of it as the
process.
80-20 rule, because I think I'm probably contributing around 20% and taking 80% and could flip it.
Well, my goal is
And
just to get to 51%.
okay,
Like,
cool. Just a little bit more. Yeah. That's beautiful too.
So
But I mean, you have that tattooed on you though, right? So if it's a natural law that everything breaks down to a certain ratio, then
let's
that's where I'm
just
sort
show
of,
that
yeah,
right there.
yeah, that's sort of where I'm playing with the 80-20. But yeah, just a little bit more, I think is a beautiful place to come from as well.
And it's also interesting seeing and sort of as a younger person, as a younger version of myself, and I don't know exactly when, maybe it was when I had kids or maybe something along the way. Like kids is a great default to be of service to somebody else because it's just like it kind of forces you to think about yourself less and think about other people more. But knowing that for a lot of my life, I was trying to get as much as I could, and like even seeing like in business relationships how I was like, oh, I used to be a taker, then I was a matcher, now I'm like a recovering taker and I'm trying to be a giver, and seeing like how it can progress.
I think that's beautiful. I want to check in to make sure that I actually answered your question or that we answered your question.
I think that's a good, because it's such a big complex thing, but I think just saying, if I had it my way, how would the world be? And there's some aspects, like we would all have these magical technology devices that could heal people, and we'd have space travel and time travel and and all this stuff. Like I want that too. And there's no clear path. I don't necessarily know of a way of like making all that stuff
But
happen.
even
So
before that, if we apply the technology that we have now with actual conscious effort and a sense of leaving the world better than we found it, and finding metrics to measure that from, the fact that there's still war happening, the fact that there's still a famine
well,
happening.
that's a whole can of worms, but almost nobody wants to be in war. But
Sure,
some people, that's how they,
make money.
get rich, right?
Yeah.
So who benefits from a war? It's a very thin slice of people that control the military industrial complex and the petrodollar system. So, I mean, partly I think just taking out these systems that misalign the desires of a few people that make everything shitty for everybody else.
Mm-hmm. And like you said, it's a big can of worms. But like my view of the future, it doesn't have to be the Star Trek model to be following the Gene Roddenberry vision, a bit more than it is, where humanity is in this together, where we are building something forward with a purpose, and we have clear aims in mind. The idea that that would happen if we ever got invaded by aliens sort of went out for me this year, watching how a virus that could have brought us all together and unified us as something that all of humanity was dealing with got spun into an us and them thing, just as bad, if not worse, than many things in the past. Makes me think that we can't wait for something external to happen for us to choose to be on the same side. We have to actually start looking at where do our values meet up, and operate from there, I think.
Well, this has been quite the we've covered a few good topics. We covered, I think it's, I mean, trauma and getting people, removing these barriers, clearing trauma individually and collectively, and then working from a place of what do I actually want? Getting away from fight or flight and into a visionary mode, as you called it. That's really important. And then the other topic we talked about is, this identity of how, what leads to, I guess is the growth mindset. It's the growth mindset we talked about, versus having to hold on to being as good as you're ever going to be versus, okay, being a beginner and being aligned with that growth trajectory versus, needing to prove that you're good just for your ego's sake.
I love it. I mean, I really enjoyed this conversation. And one of the things that I've always appreciated about talking to you is like what you just did, highlighting the value inside of the conversation. So even though I've enjoyed it, one of the things that I've suffered from is something that I talk other people through, which is my normal is normal to me. So the things that I talk about and care about, I sometimes forget aren't as commonplace as they feel inside of my brain. and so I appreciate the opportunity to dive into some of these topics and to hear your takes on so many things. And then also the humility that I hear from you, because I think it's the same thing the other way, where things that are normal for you aren't normal for everyone, aren't necessarily normal for me. And so I got a lot of value from it. And I especially love that simple reframe of when things feel challenging, going into excitement and saying, oh, this is what it feels before I get really good at something. I get good at things very quickly. And to normalize that growth period instead of resisting it, I think is very powerful.
Well, let's give each other the opportunity. Is there anything you want to plug? Any stuff you got coming up, or where should people look for you?
I'm just relaunching my life and myself and the podcast. So it's been a year of me recovering and not really putting a lot of content out. So listen to the Life Athletics podcast. Come and find me at Nik Wood Life on Instagram or Life Athletics on Instagram. I do have another project around some of the subjects that we were talking about that is in the very beginner stage as far as putting together a structure to show other people, but is built around this idea of creating shared vision for the future and then how to make that actionable. And so, come check me out for more on that.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you.
And I mean, same thing for you. Anything you want to plug? You have a new podcast coming out, or that's out. I don't know where it's at.
Right now. Yeah. This is super exciting. It's a rebrand for people listening on my show. You've noticed Art of Adventure became the Derek Loudermilk Show. Well, what's going on there? Partly it's brand equity in people. It's the name equity for myself versus a brand that's outside of myself. But also I feel like I've explored the topic of adventure probably more than anyone on the planet. I would say I'm a PhD level understanding of adventure and adventurers, and I'm ready to expand and really where I see my show as being important is bringing the ideas that humanity needs right now. And these are really looking for cutting edge ideas. And on some of these concepts, anything from Ubuntu or quantum mechanics or whatever it is, what is a top percentile understanding? Like what is a sort of a master's level or PhD level understanding, and bringing on people that can get us there? Because I think there's a lot of podcasts out there that will get you your basics covered if you're beginning as an entrepreneur or beginning as a digital nomad or beginning as a whatever. And what I'm not seeing a ton of is really in-depth, sort of second order or higher order conversations. And that's really where I think I need to go. And it's going to be, as we pointed out, of service to humanity, and largely introducing ideas that people haven't really spent much time thinking about, or the opposite of what most people are saying, when the world zigs, like, how do we zag? Well, we got to have the right ideas to know what zagging looks like. So
I
that's the
love
idea
that.
behind the show.
I think I heard this from Tim Ferriss, but he talked about how a lot of people are scrambling for the bottom, and upper levels are usually less populated. And so there's something that's really powerful about just stepping to the upper levels and learning from there. So yeah, I'm excited to listen. I've always enjoyed your show, and I've gotten a lot of value from listening to it through the years. So I highly
Well, thank
encourage
you.
people to go check it out.
Thank you.
So life athletes, remember, it's your life, it's your game, level up. That's how I finish the show. Do you have a lead off line?
Used to be stay adventurous, so now I'll just do like a but
All right.
yeah, it's a good place to wrap, and we'll talk soon.
I look forward to it.
All right,
Take
Nick.
care.
Bye.
Bye.